The third week of her service at Weniston Court, on a grey morning in late October, Damaris Brendel stood in the long gallery with her wrists held out for inspection, while a footman turned the pockets of her apron inside out before 12 witnesses. Her hands did not shake. She had decided somewhere in the cold passage between the kitchen and the gallery that her hands would not shake, and so they did not, though her heart beat so hard against the bone of her throat that she was certain the woman watching her could hear it. The Dowager Duchess stood at the gallery's end with her gloved fingers folded over the head of an ebony cane. She did not need to walk, and she watched Damaris the way a careful woman watches a clock she suspects of running fast. A miniature was missing, a small oval of ivory in a gold frame, the late Duke's likeness taken from the Dowager's own sitting room. It had been there at noon. It was gone by 4. And the new housemaid, the clockmaker's daughter from the village who read too well and curtsied a half-second too slow, had been the one to lay the fire in that room. That was the whole of the case against her. And it was enough. She did not yet know who had taken the miniature. She did not yet know that the woman at the gallery's end knew exactly where it was. She knew only that she was 3 weeks into a position she had needed the way a person treading water needs a rope, and that the rope was being cut fiber by fiber in front of her. The Duke came down the gallery at 11:15. She had seen him only twice before that morning, both times at a distance, both times so still and so dark in his navy coat that he had seemed less a man than a portrait that had learned to walk. Tobiah, Duke of Falconbridge. The village said he had not smiled since his father's burial 2 winters past. The village said a great many things, and Damaris, who had laid fires in the rooms where great families said the things they did not mean for villages to hear, had learned to weigh all of it lightly. She weighed him now, though, because her future hung on whatever was set behind that carved and unmoving face, and she could read nothing there at all. He listened to his mother. He listened to the footman. He looked once at the turned-out pockets of the apron, and once, briefly, at Damaris herself, and in that single glance she felt the whole machinery of the house settle its weight onto her like a stone laid on a chest. "Pay her what she is owed to the day," he said, his voice low, "and see her off the grounds by noon." He did not raise his voice. He did not call her a thief, in so many words. He turned and walked back the way he had come, and the sound of his boots on the parquet was the sound of a door closing somewhere far inside the house, and Damaris understood that she had been weighed by a man who had not troubled to look, and found without examination wanting. It is a strange thing to be undone by indifference rather than by malice. Malice, at least, grants its object the dignity of mattering. Remember the sound of those boots. You will hear them again in a colder season walking toward her, instead of away. She was off the grounds by 11:30. She did not ask for the half-hour she had been granted. She gathered her 2 gowns and her mother's thimble, and the small brass key that opened nothing she still owned, and she walked the 4 miles back to Halewick, in a thin mantle that could not quite manage the wind off the fields, and she did not weep until she was past the lodge gates, and certain no one at Weniston. To Weniston Court she was, by noon that day, simply the maid the Duke had dismissed. The thing was decided. The household decided it the way households decide such things. In the scullery, in the stable, in the still-room, all at once, and without appeal. And by supper there was not a servant under that roof who did not believe the clockmaker's daughter had stolen the old Duke's face out of its frame and been justly turned out for it. There was one exception, though Damaris did not know it, and would not know it for a long while yet. Lord Caradoc Conyngham, the Duke's younger brother, had been in the stable-yard when the dismissal was carried out, and he had not believed a word of it. To understand why, one must go back, and the going back is the whole heart of this, so let it be unhurried. Damaris had not been born to scrub other women's hearths. Her father, Brannock Brendel, had been the finest clockmaker in 3 parishes, a man whose hands could coax a stopped movement back to life, as gently as another man might wake a sleeping child. In the small house above his workshop in Halewick, she had grown up among the patient tick of 100 mechanisms, learning her letters from the trade catalogues, learning her numbers from the ledgers, learning from her father a single stubborn article of faith that would cost her dearly and save her entirely, that a thing was worth precisely what it did, and not a farthing more, for the name stamped on its case. Then her mother died of a fever in one hard March, and her father's right hand began to tremble, slowly at first and then not slowly, until the trembling took the work from him as a thief takes a purse a little at a time. And then all at once, the fine commissions went elsewhere. The debts came in. By the autumn she was 24. Damaris had sold the workshop's tools one by one to keep her father in coal and broth, and when the last good lathe was gone, she did the only thing a respectable girl with an educated hand and no fortune could do. She went into service. She did not tell her father it shamed her. She told him it was a great adventure, and she made him laugh, and then she walked to Weniston Court and curtsied to a housekeeper and became a pair of hands. She was good at it. That was, in the end, the trouble. A housemaid who lays a fire so the smoke draws clean, who notices that the long case clock on the stair has lost 4 minutes, and quietly tells the steward, who can read a delivery account and find the error in it, is a housemaid who is seen. And at Weniston Court, being seen by the wrong eyes was a danger Damaris had not been raised to measure. The wrong eyes belonged to the Dowager Duchess of Falconbridge. Her name was Hoesia. She had governed that house for 30 years, through her husband's life and her husband's death and into the long stewardship of her elder son's grief. And she governed it still, from the green sitting room where the late Duke's miniature hung, by 1,000 small decisions that no one ever thought to question, because they had always been hers to make. She was not a cruel woman, and that is a thing worth holding on to. She was a woman who had been told from the cradle that the order of the world was a fragile and a holy thing, and that her whole purpose was to keep it whole, and she believed this with the unbreakable confidence of a person whose belief has never once been tested by the world telling her no. And she had decided, watching the clockmaker's daughter cross her hall with that straight back and that quiet, competent grace, that the order of the world was in some small and growing danger. For Lord Caradoc had begun to watch the new housemaid. Caradoc was 28, the second son, the one the entail had made gentle by sparing him its weight, where his brother the Duke had been carved by responsibility into something hard, and still Caradoc had been left soft enough to be kind, and clever enough to be restless, and he had spent his whole life in the comfortable shadow of a title that would never be his. His mother had a use for him. There was a Lady Rosanna Gildersleeve, an heiress of good family and £40,000, who had been understood since both were children to be the correct and waiting answer to the question of Caradoc's future. The match would knit 2 estates. The match would secure the line's fortune against the Duke's stubborn refusal to marry and breed an heir of his own. The match was, in the Dowager's careful arithmetic, very nearly the last large thing she had left to set right. And Caradoc, who had agreed to it the way one agrees to weather, had begun to linger in the gallery when the clockmaker's daughter was at her work, and to ask her opinion of the stair clock, and to laugh, once, at something dry she said about the household's accounts, in a way his mother had not heard him laugh in 2 years. The Dowager saw it, the way she saw everything, early and entire. She did not rage. Rage was for women without resources. She simply understood that the housemaid must go, and that she must go in a manner that closed the door behind her so firmly it could never be reopened. And so she went into the green sitting room one gray afternoon, and took the late Duke's miniature down from its frame, and put it in the locked drawer of her own writing desk. And then she rang for the footman to ask whether anything seemed amiss in the room. She would have called it protecting her sons. She believed it as she did it. What she did not weigh, because her categories had no slot for it, was the clockmaker's daughter herself. What such a girl was made of, what such a girl would do. What Damaris did the first night home was sit at her father's bedside and tell him she had given up the position because the hours were cruel and she missed him, and hold his trembling hand until he slept, and then go down to the cold, dark workshop and weep with her fist pressed against her mouth so the sound would not climb the stair. She did not weep long. She had a sick father, and £11 between them, and the winter coming on, and weeping was a luxury priced beyond her means. Then she lit a stub of candle, and did the thing that her whole life had trained her to do. She thought about the problem like a clock. A clock that runs wrong does not lie. Somewhere in it, a single tooth is bent, a single pivot worn, and the fault is always specific and always findable if one is patient enough to look. The miniature had not walked out of a locked house. On its own legs, someone had moved it. And the only person in that house, with both the means to move it and the reason to want Damaris gone, was the woman who had stood at the end of the gallery and watched the apron turned out without the smallest flicker of surprise. She could prove nothing. She knew that a housemaid's certainty was not worth the breath it took to speak it. She filed the thought away regardless, the way her father had taught her to file away a fault she could not yet reach. And she went on with the harder, nearer work of keeping her father alive. She did not know that 4 miles away in the stable yard at Wenhaston, Lord Caradoc had been filing away a thought of his own. He had liked her. That was the simple and inconvenient truth of it, and Caradoc was honest enough with himself to name it plainly. He had liked the straight back and the dry voice, and the way she spoke to the stair clock, as though it were a person whose feelings might be hurt. And he did not believe, not for 1 hour, that the girl who had quietly told the steward the house was being overcharged for its candles had then turned around and pocketed his father's likeness. The arithmetic of it was wrong. A thief who wanted gold did not first save her master 4 pounds on tallow. So Caradoc did a quiet thing. He did not confront his mother, because he had never in his life won an argument with his mother, and was not fool enough to start with one he could not yet prove. He went, instead, to the village. He went to Halewick under the cover of a horse that needed a thrown shoe seen to, and at the smithy he asked, idly, about the clockmaker's family, and learned that the old clockmaker was dying by inches, and that his daughter had come home to nurse him. He learned that the girl had been a credit to the village and that no one in Halewick believed the tale that had come down from the court, which was its own kind of evidence, because villages are merciless about their own and do not defend a thief. And he learned one thing more, from the pawnbroker 2 doors down, a thing he did not understand the weight of until much later. He learned that a gentlewoman's manservant from up at the great house had come to that pawnbroker some weeks past with a small object to sell in secret, and had been turned away because the broker did not care to traffic in goods that smelled of a great family's quarrels. Caradoc rode home with that splinter lodged in him and told no one. The winter came on hard. Brannock lived through Advent on broth and his daughter's stubbornness, and then, on a still blue morning just after the turn of the year, with his good hand closed over hers, he stopped living, as gently as one of his own movements running down. Damaris buried him in the Halewick churchyard under a sky the color of pewter, with the parson and 3 old neighbors for mourners, and she came home to an empty house, and a workbench full of other people's broken clocks that no one would now repair, and she understood that she was entirely alone in the world, and very nearly out of money. That was the lowest she had yet been brought. It was not, you should know, the lowest she would go. She did the only thing left. She took up her father's tools, the few she had not sold, and she finished the clocks. She had watched him all her life. Her hands were steady where his had failed. One by one she returned the mended movements to their owners, the farmer's bracket clock and the parson's watch in the long case from the inn at the crossroads, and one by one the owners paid her and looked at her sideways, because a young woman with a clockmaker's hands was a thing the parish did not quite know how to hold. It was the long case from the crossroads inn that changed everything, though she did not know it when she carried it home to mend. Lord Caradoc found her in February, in the cold workshop with her sleeves pushed back and a loop screwed into her eye, and the whole gutted movement of the inn's clock spread before her on a green cloth. He had told himself he came to commission a repair. He had a watch, his father's watch, that had stopped on the day of the funeral 2 winters past, and that no one had been able to start again, and he carried it now as his excuse, and the excuse was even partly true. Then he stood in the workshop doorway with the gray light behind him and watched the dismissed housemaid lift a wheel, no bigger than a shilling, on the point of a pin, holding her breath the way a person holds a candle in a draught, and he forgot entirely what he had come to say. "You will let in the cold, my lord," she said, without looking up. "And the cold makes the oil thick. If you mean to stand there, close the door." He closed the door. It was the first command anyone had given him in years that he obeyed, without resenting. She would not take his father's watch at first. She knew whose it was, and whose son he was, and exactly how it would look. The dismissed thief, mending the stolen man's son's watch. And she told him so, plainly, in the level voice that had cost her everything at Wenniston. And Caradoc, who had spent his whole life agreeing to weather, found that he could not agree to this. He sat down on the workshop stool uninvited, and he told her the thing he had carried since October, that he had not believed it. Add, that he had gone to the pawnbroker, that a manservant from the great house had tried in secret to sell a small object weeks before the miniature was ever missed, and that he did not yet understand it, but that he meant to. Damaris set down her loop and looked at him for a long moment, and something in her chest that had been clenched like a fist since the gallery began very slowly to open. "Weeks before," she said. "Before it was missed. Before anyone had said a word of it being gone. Then, it was not stolen the day. I laid the fire," she said quietly. "It was taken before, and kept, and produced when it was wanted." She did not say the rest. She did not need to. They sat in the cold workshop with the truth between them, like a movement laid bare on the green cloth, every wheel of it visible, and neither of them yet able to make it strike. What grew between them, through that long, cold spring, grew the way frost flowers grow on a window, slowly and in silence, and only where the conditions are exact. He came back. He always had a reason, and the reasons grew thinner each time, and they both knew it. She mended his father's watch and would take no payment for it, and he understood, accepting it from her hands, rerunning at last, that the refusal was itself a gift and not an insult. They spoke of clocks, and then of books, and then, carefully, of the dead. His father and her father, 2 men, gone, and 2 children left holding the broken movements they had loved them for. He did not touch her. Once, handing her a wheel, his bare fingers met her bare fingers, and they both went still as the workshop clock ticked 4 times into the silence. And then she drew her hand back and bent again over her work. And that was all. And it was everything. He asked her to marry him in April, standing in the churchyard where her father lay, because it was the only ground in the parish where he could be sure his mother's eyes did not reach. She told him no because she loved him, which was precisely why she could not do it. She knew what she was. The dismissed thief, the clockmaker's daughter, the maid. The Duke had turned out at noon. She knew what his marrying her would cost him. The door it would close, the mother it would break with, the Lady Rosanna and the £40,000 and the knitted estates, all of it. She would not be the ruin of the one man who had looked at her and seen a person. She had her father's stubborn faith that a thing was worth what it did and not the name on its case, and she turned it now against her own happiness, and she told him, in the churchyard, in the rain, that he must marry where his family needed him, and forget the workshop in Halewick. He did not argue. That was what undid her later, remembering it. He did not deliver a speech. He took off his glove and took her bare hand in his bare hand, there over her father's grave, and he held it. And he said only, his voice level, "I do not want a fortune. I want to come in out of the cold." Then he let her hand go, and rode away, and left her to it. She married him 3 weeks later. She could not have told it plainly had anyone asked, for she had not so much decided it as stopped being able to refuse it. He came back and back. He sent no jewels, made no speeches, laid no siege. He brought her a broken clock from the inn, and a book she had mentioned, and once a single pressed flower from the Wenniston grounds folded into a sheet of paper, a small white star of an autumn anemone, the last bloom of a thing already past its season. and she pressed it flat in her father's trade catalogue between the pages on escapements. And she kept it, and she knew then that she was lost. They were married quietly in the Halewick church, on a morning in May, by the same parson who had buried her father, with the pawnbroker and the innkeeper and Mrs. Mater. Crail, the Wenhaston housekeeper, who had come down on her half-day in secret and wept into her good handkerchief, for the only witnesses. Lord Caradoc Conyngham took the dismissed housemaid's hand and married her under God and his own name, and asked no one's leave. And when it was done, he set her up before him on his horse, and rode her the 4 miles back to Wenhaston Court. Up the long drive she had walked down in November in a thin mantle, and through the lodge gates she had wept past. And to the great door from which she had been turned out at noon, she returned to that house, as Lord Caradoc's wife, as the Duke's brother's wife, as Lady Caradoc, who must be curtsied to in the very gallery where her wrists had been held out for inspection by the men who now must bow. The Dowager Duchess was waiting in the green sitting-room, and she did not faint, and she did not rage, and she did not crumble. She had been governing that house for 30 years, and she had not the smallest intention of stopping now. She looked at her younger son and his clockmaker bride standing in her hall with the May light behind them, and her face, for one hinge of a moment, showed the single calculation passing behind it, cold and quick and entire. She would not weep. She would win. "You have made a great mistake," the dowager said to her son, her voice polished and even, calibrated to wound while remaining technically courteous. "And I shall be the one to mend it, as I have mended every mistake this family has ever made. The marriage of a gentleman to a convicted thief is no marriage at all. It is an error of judgment, and errors of judgment can be undone." That was the first time Damaris understood that being married had not ended the danger. It had only raised the stakes of it, for the dowager did not bluster. She acted. Within the week, she had sent for the family's man of business, a careful grey solicitor named Mr. Bracht. Well, Quenelin put it to him that grounds might be found to set the marriage aside. A marriage entered into by a woman who had concealed a crime, a woman against whom there stood a charge of theft witnessed by 12 persons in the long gallery. And she did more than that. She sent quietly for the footman, who had turned out the pockets of the apron in October, and she made certain he remembered very precisely what he had seen. And she had the late Duke's miniature, which had spent the winter in the locked drawer of her writing desk, brought out and shown to Mr. Renia. Quesnel, as the very object the housemaid had been accused of stealing, recovered, she said, from the girl's effects. At the time, the proof entire, she had foreseen this. That was the thing Damaris came to understand. Lying awake in the unfamiliar grand bedchamber with her husband slow breathing beside her, the dowager had not been caught off guard by the marriage. The moment she had taken the miniature down in October, she had built the case that would survive its own exposure, the witness primed, the object kept, the story sealed. She had armored the lie against the day someone might come to undo it. She was not a woman who left a thing unguarded. The household, which had decided in October that Damaris was a thief, decided now, with equal speed, that she was a thief who had schemed her way into the family she had robbed, and the whispers ran along the back stairs like fire along a fuse. It was Mrs. Crail, the housekeeper, who carried the worst of it up to her, loyally and unhappily, on a grey morning, a week after the wedding, sitting on the edge of a chair she would not properly take, and twisting her apron in her 2 hands. "They are saying below stairs, my lady," Mrs. Crail said, low and wretched, unable to meet her eye, "that you are the thieving maid who stole the old Duke's face and crept back to steal his son. I will not have it said in my hearing, and I box the ears of any girl who says it, and still it is said." Damaris thanked her and asked her to box no more ears, and sat a long while after the housekeeper had gone, hearing the words settle, the same verdict that had walked her down the drive in November come round again to find her in her own married rooms. Then came the day the thing was said to her face, in the open where it could not be unheard. Lady Rosanna Gildersleeve, who had come to Wenniston expecting an engagement, and found instead a clockmaker's daughter wearing the name that should have been hers, said it in the drawing-room before a dozen guests. "She was the maid your brother dismissed for theft," Lady Rosanna said, looking not at Damaris but at the Duke, her voice clear and carrying. "And now she is to be called sister by the House of Falconbridge. I wonder that your father's portrait does not turn its face to the wall." The room went silent. Damaris stood in the center of it, in a gown that was not borrowed and did not belong to her either, and she felt the old cold gallery feeling come over her, the weight of the house settling onto her chest, and she understood that she had walked back into the very arena where the verdict had first been passed. She did not defend herself. She had learned long ago that a thief's protest of innocence is only more thievery to ears already decided. She demonstrated instead the single thing she had, which was her worth, and she did it without a word, by crossing the silent drawing-room to where the long case clock stood against the wall, the great clock of Wenniston Court, that had not kept good time in living memory, and that the household had long since stopped trying to correct. And she opened its case, and she looked into its movement the way she had looked into 100 others. And she found the fault, a worn pivot fouling the train. In under a minute, and she said quietly, "To no one and to everyone. There. It has been losing 11 minutes a day for 30 years, and no one in this house ever once opened its case to see why. It was not a defense. It was a sentence about a clock. And every soul in that drawing-room heard the other thing underneath it, the thing she did not say, that this house had a long habit of never opening a thing to see what was truly inside it, and that what it found when it finally did might not be what it had decided was there. The Duke heard it most of all, for the cold man, the carved and unmoving Duke, who had dismissed her at 11:15 on a gray October morning without troubling to look, had been, all this while, beginning to look. He had said almost nothing since the marriage. He had watched his mother build her case and his brother's wife endure the whispers, and he had felt, beneath the long ice of his grief, the first crack of a question he could not put down. He had failed his father by being unable to be glad after his death. He had failed his house by refusing to marry and breed it an heir. He had spent 2 years certain that he failed at everything that required him to feel. And here in his own hall was a woman his brother had risked everything for, and the only fact he truly knew about her was that he had thrown her out without looking, on his mother's word, because looking had become a thing he no longer trusted himself to do. So, the Duke of Falconbridge did the thing that would cost him most. He looked. He sent quietly, and on his own authority, for the pawnbroker of Halewick, the man his brother had mentioned to him in a low voice one evening. And he had the man brought to the green sitting-room, and he asked him, before the Dowager and Mr. Quennell and Lady Rosanna and the assembled house, a single question, level and unhurried. Whether anyone from Wenniston Court had ever come to him to sell a small gold-framed object in secret, and when. The pawnbroker, who was an honest man and frightened to be in such a room, said that yes, a gentlewoman's manservant had come to him in the last week of September, weeks before Michaelmas, with a small ivory miniature in a gold frame, and had asked him to take it quietly, and that he had refused, because the object smelled of a great family's troubles, and that he had a record of the turned-away offer in his book, as he kept a record of all such things, with the date, the last week of September, before October, before the fire was ever laid, before the wrists were ever held out. The miniature had been gone from its frame and offered for secret sale a fortnight before the day the clockmaker's daughter was accused of taking it. It could not have been stolen by Damaris on the afternoon she laid the fire, because by then it had already left the house once and been carried back. The only person who could have carried it out and back, who had the keys and the manservant and the locked writing desk drawer, stood at the end of the room with her gloved hand white on the head of a cane she did not need. The Dowager's manservant, pressed in that room, did not hold. He had been loyal for 30 years, and he was loyal still. But he was an old man and an honest one underneath the loyalty, and when the Duke looked at him and asked him plainly whether his mistress had bid him sell the miniature and then return it to her keeping, the old man's loyalty and his honesty broke against each other, and the honesty won. as Damaris's fathers had one in him long ago, and he said very low, "She bid me, your grace, to be rid of the new girl." She said no real harm would come of it. She said the girl had no people to be hurt. That was the whole of the dowager's error, laid bare on the green cloth at last, every wheel of it visible. She had chosen Damaris precisely because Damaris was alone, a girl with a dying father and no fortune, and no one to take her part, the safest possible person to ruin. She had been confidently, catastrophically wrong, not about the order of the world, but about the one thing her categories could not measure, which was what such a girl was worth, and what her worth would summon to her side. She had reckoned the clockmaker's daughter as nothing, and the nothing had married her son and mended the unmendable clock and brought the truth up out of a pawnbroker's book like a wheel lifted on the point of a pin. The room waited. Damaris did not gloat. She did not speak at all. She had her vindication, and she held it the way she held a delicate movement carefully, taking no triumph in it, because triumph was a luxury, and because the woman exposed before her was, whatever else she was, her husband's mother, and there were children of this house, unborn, who would need a grandmother. And Damaris was not in the business of breaking things that might still be mended. It was the Duke who spoke the words that ended it. He crossed the room. He did not cross it quickly. He came to where his brother's wife stood, alone in the cleared center of the floor, the same floor, very nearly where he had told the footman to turn out her pockets, and he stopped before her. And in the held silence of that house, he did the thing that the whole long winter had been bending toward. "You are my sister," the Duke said, "and you are no thief." 12 words. He had counted none of them, and they were 12 all the same, specific and irrevocable, a name claimed in the very arena where the verdict had first been passed. He did not denounce his mother. He did not banish the manservant or call for the magistrate or grind the dowager's face into the floor of her own hall. He had learned, perhaps from watching the clockmaker's daughter, that the minimum sufficient was its own kind of mercy. He claimed his sister, and in claiming her he displaced his mother from the throne of the family's verdict, as gently and as completely as a corrected clock displaces a wrong one. And the house, which had decided twice already, decided a third and final time and got it right. The dowager did not fall to the floor. She was made of harder stuff than that, and her ruin was never the thing this house required. She stood very straight at the end of the room with her hand on her cane, and her polished, even voice, when she found it, came out in fragments, the calibration gone from it at last. "I did what was needed," she said. "I have always. Someone must keep it whole." And there was, behind the fragments, the dawning of a thing that was almost worse than shame, for such a woman, which was the recognition that the order she had spent her whole life protecting had never needed protecting from this girl at all, and that she had broken it herself, with her own gloved hands in the very act of keeping it whole. She left the room. No one stopped her. She went to the green sitting room, where the late Duke's miniature hung once more in its frame, and she sat a long while alone with her husband's painted face, and what passed there passed where no one could witness it, which was as it should be. The marriage stood. Mr. Quennell folded his papers and found no grounds, because there were none. Lady Rosanna and her £40,000 went home to her own county, corrected and not destroyed, and married an earl within the year, and was by all accounts content, which was more than her cruelty in the drawing-room had earned. The household, which had whispered along the back stairs, found new things to whisper about as households do, and within a season the tale had turned itself inside out in the telling, until half of them claimed to have known all along that the clockmaker's daughter was no thief, which was a lie, and a forgivable one. Damaris did not move into the grandest rooms. She and Caradoc took the small east apartments that looked over the kitchen gardens, and she set up a workbench by the window where the morning light was good. And she went on mending clocks, the households and the villages, and, in time, those of half the county. Because a great lady who could bring a stopped movement back to life was a wonder people would drive 20 miles to see. The great long-case clock of Wenniston Court the one she had opened in the silent drawing room, kept perfect time from that day, and the household measured its hours by the clockmaker's daughter's repair, and most of them never thought about what that meant, and a few of them did. There was one more thing, and it belongs here. At the close, told gently. The dowager did not soften all at once, because real people do not. And for a long while, she and her younger son's wife moved through the same house, like two clocks set to slightly different times. There came an evening the following winter, though snow at the windows and the fires lit, when the dowager came stiffly into the east apartments with a small object held in her gloved hand and set it down on the workbench by the window without quite meeting Damaris's eyes. It was a watch, a lady's watch, very old and very fine, that had been her own mother's and that had not run in 40 years. They tell me, the dowager said, that you are able to wake the things others have given up for dead. Damaris took up the watch. She turned it in the lamplight the way her father had taught her, looking not for the name on the case but for what the things still did. And she said quietly that she would try. It was not forgiveness. Forgiveness is a larger and a slower mechanism than that, and it was still, that winter, somewhere down in the works, not yet reached. It was the first wheel of it all the same, set turning, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so. Caradoc found them there an hour later, his wife with the loop screwed into her eye, and his mother sitting near in the firelight, watching the small steady hands take a dead thing apart to find the single bent tooth that had stopped it. And he stood in the doorway and did not let in the cold. And he watched, and he understood that he had, in the end, gotten the only thing he had ever asked for. He had wanted to come in out of the cold. He had married the one person in all of England who could not be bought, and could not be hurried, and could not be fooled about what a thing was truly worth, and she had brought him in, and his whole hard winter of a family in with him. On the workbench between them, in her father's trade catalogue, pressed flat between the pages on escapements, the small white anemone lay where it had lain since November. The last bloom of a thing already past its season, kept, and not forgotten, and worth, by the only measure that had ever mattered to her, precisely everything. The snow came down past the windows. The great clock below struck the hour, true to the minute, and the house kept time at last. If Damaris Brendel's long walk home moved you, stay a moment in the quiet of it before you go, and remember the ones the world turns out at noon, without troubling to look. They are so often worth the looking. The narrator thanks you for staying until the end.